This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
So we've got Steve Purcell, Assistant Professor in the English Department of the University of Warwick and Director of the theatre company The Pantaloons. And the Pantaloons are going to start touring with a new production of The Tempest in July. His main emphasis of research is Shakespeare in performance, and I just want to mention a very recent book on audience research that Steve has published. It's entitled Shakespeare and Audience in Practice, and it appeared in the Palgrave Macmillan series, 2013. And then we have P.A. Scanse.
You're the only person who's ever pronounced it correctly.
Oh,
I think I know why that is.
And P.A. Director-owned company for Second Decay. It's a performance company which does very intriguing projects, including a physical radio show. She's also a reader in performance practices at Roehampton University, and again I'd just like to mention one very recent publication also on the relationship between spectator and spectacle, and it's entitled The Itinerant Spectator, Itinerant Spectacle, came out in 2013.
Thanks for that introduction. I feel given that introduction, in fact, and given the title, I should probably do this paper in mine, but I'm not going to, for reasons that perhaps will become apparent. I rather provocatively titled this Shakespeare and the International Language or Languages of Clowning, but I'm going to be questioning the extent to which clowning is a language. And I'd like to think about this question through the lens of a number of productions which were performed in this city 2 years ago as part of the Globe to Globe Festival, although I'll make reference to several other productions. Numerous commentators identified a recurring trend in the productions which visited Shakespeare's Globe for the 2012 Globe to Globe Festival. Randall Martin, for example, speaks for many when in his essay for Shakespeare Beyond English he observes that, quote, "Watching Shakespeare performed during the festival in half a dozen languages I don't understand has made one thing clear. The most successful productions have used physical expression and non-verbal modes of communication to connect the locally transformed plays to globe audiences." Emma Cox's essay for the same collection notes a particular subcategory of this strategy when she describes the presence of, quote, "physical comedy, innuendo, sly winks at the audience and participation in the Kenyan Merry Wives of Windsor as fairly recognisable means of attracting laughs. Indeed, from the pratfalls and comic leaps of the Afghan comedy of errors to the ensemble choreography and fish impersonations of the Greek Pericles, from the frantic mimes of the British Sign Language Love's Labour's Lost to the clownish, stilt-walking tragedians of the Brazilian Romeo and Juliet, comic physical movement seems to be a key tool in establishing a rapport between the actors and an audience who were often, in large part, unable to understand the spoken language. These strategies might, of course, have been specific to this festival with its open stage venue and its rule that despite the predominantly English-speaking audience, no English should be spoken on stage, a rule that should be noted that was often transgressed. Nonetheless, the recurrence of physical clowning in these productions made me think about the extent to which other practitioners interested in intercultural performance have turned to the fore. Is clowning, I began to wonder, a truly international language? Before I pursue this question any further, it may be worth illustrating some of the ways in which one particular festival production employed the form. I was struck upon watching the Afghan comedy of errors by the strange familiarity of its clowning routines. Arsalan and Bostan of Samarkand, or this production's Antipholus and Dromio of Syracuse, made a hash of their attempt to dress like the locals in Kabul, standing in here for Ephesus. Bostan of Kabul attempted to dissuade an amorous Kukeb or Nell by stuffing food into her mouth. Bostan of Samarkand repeatedly leapt into his master's arms as he heard her offstage call. Kukeb was played by this male actor in drag. When Arsalan of Kabul was arrested, he mimed his handcuffs to musical accompaniment, responding with a physical jerk whenever the flute played by his arresting officer indicated that he was being pushed. I was reminded in many of these instances of the lazzi of Commedia dell'arte, portable visual gags which can be lifted from the repertoire when required for the service of particular comic moments. Closer research into this production revealed that it was, in fact, employing a distinctly European performance vocabulary. The Comedy of Errors was directed by Corinne Chabert, a Paris-based actor and director who trained with the renowned clown and teacher Philippe Gaulier before working with Peter Brook on his world tour of the Margarata. Her production opened with 3 musicians laying down a carpet, a visual nod, I thought, to Brooks' famous intercultural carpet shows, which toured African villages in the 1970s, and which, in the words of Colin Counsell, consisted largely of miming, clowning, movement, and music, those means which are often thought capable of communicating in the absence of a shared language. Indeed, Stephen Landrigan's account of Jabert's 2005 production of Love's Labour's Lost in Kabul notes that she started rehearsals by spreading out just such a carpet. The intention, he says, was, quote, to establish a sense of immediacy that eliminated barriers between actors and audience. One might question the extent to which such a transcendence of cultural difference is possible. Counsell certainly critiques Brooks' quest for a, quote, universal language of the theatre. Note the phrasing there, universal language of the theatre, suggesting that his carpet shows were predicated on a fundamental misconception. One such show, the Shoe Show, was met with bafflement in a village in Nigeria, for example, because what had seemed to the performers like an obvious and universal idea, I'm using Counsell's words here, magical objects transform people, was a European fairy tale trope which was not familiar to that particular audience. The Nigerian village audience's interpretive difficulties, argues Counsell, quote, illustrates the most fundamental flaw in Brooks' project, for his search for a universal theatrical language is based on a misunderstanding of what language actually is. As Counsell suggests, language is by its nature a coded system of communication, which can be decoded only by those who are already familiar with its codes. Physical language, by this reasoning, can transcend culture no more than its verbal counterparts can. I'll be putting some pressure on that idea in a minute. The globe-to-globe production in which this principle was at its clearest was perhaps definitely theatre's Love's Labour's Lost. Performed in British Sign Language, its meanings were fully available only to those spectators who were fluent in BSL. This is not to say that the production's use of gesture was limited to this language, however. Kate Rumbold's essay on the production notes that its physical vocabulary was, quote, somewhere between BSL, including fingerspelling, and large-scale theatrical gesture. Thus, for example, the company's translation of not to see a woman in that term involves the miming of a voluptuous hourglass figure, a gestural cartoon accessible to those spectators without any sign language, while David Sand's costard, reminiscent for me of a silent movie clown, indicated his coarse undercutting of Boyer's attempts at authority by pretending to turn the latter's testicles into bowling balls. Definitely's version, concludes Rumbold, reminds us how often hearing companies, too, gesture their way through this play in order to help hearing audiences make sense of less comprehensible stretches of language. As these examples indicate, even a show which is based on a very specific gestural language might feel compelled to stretch beyond the limits of that language towards a more generalised physical system of communication. But how generalised can this communication become? When the National Theatre of Greece performed Pericles, they made use of a physical style which would be familiar to audiences of companies like Complicite or Told by an Idiot. Between sequences of extended physical clowning, there's one going on in that image there, the whole ensemble would transform into a billowing sea or the sleeping crew of a rocking ship. Becky Becker's piece on the production coins the term embodied spectatorship to describe the effect of the production's movement upon its audience. It was the use of the actors' bodies on stage and in relationship to the spectators' bodies in the space, she argues, that ultimately spoke the language of the play. bodies speaking language. The ensemble, she goes on, moved through Pericles' life journey with the audience physically in tow. My own account of the same production for Year of Shakespeare made a similar observation, noting that the onstage ensemble watched their fellow actors with a physical intensity that encouraged their globe audience, their mirrors, to do the same. Recent research in cognitive science has suggested that empathy is, in part, a physiological state in which the human being's mirror neuron system is activated in response to the sight of another human body performing a particular physical action. Thus, in the play's final scene, Becker observes that she could, quote, hear Pericles' body speaking, even when his words did not readily translate. An international language, then. In The Moving Body, Jacques Lecoq wrote about what he called the universal poetic sense, a, quote, abstract dimension made up of spaces, lights, colours, materials, sounds, which can be found in all of us. And his teaching work was aimed at enabling his students to develop a language of gestures, language again, which would appeal to this sense. In a fascinating essay on Shakespeare and the Lecoq tradition, Darren Tunstall defends Lecoq from potential accusations of naive essentialism on this matter, arguing that these gestures can be seen as emerging out of the fundamental laws of movement, drawn as they are from Galilean and Newtonian mechanics. This chimes very strongly, I think, with the festival's most overtly clown-inspired production, Brazilian street theatre troupe Grupo Galpeo's Romeo and Juliet. Inspired by Peter Brook's 1970 production of A Midsummer Night's Dream, this company transposed Romeo and Juliet's verbal imagery of precarious balance and elevation and dangerous falls into a literal presentation, performing much of the play on stilts. In an interview with Jacqueline Bessel, their artistic director and leading actor, Eduardo Moreira, describes the rehearsal process in which the company delivered the text, quote, on a very narrow plank about 2.5 metres above the ground, meaning, he says, that the words gained a nervousness, a strong intensity. It's in translating or transposing verbal text into physical metaphor, I would argue, that such work achieves its broadest intercultural reach. Lecoq advocates a process which he calls mimodynamics, in which the actor finds the physical metaphor implied in the word and performs the action. The Lecoq-trained actor Marcello Magni explained this to me in an interview. I'm going to quote him at length now. There must be always, he says, well, there he is, Marcello Magni, there must be always, in the relationship of a play, a certain tactic. In life, we're like that. We charm, we entice. I see it in a playful way, like a game. So then I have to put it physically on stage. I have to find the dynamic of that play. Either it's attraction, pulling, or it's pushing, it's rejection. And then there are many different variations on doing that. Searching, hunting, they're all physical expressions. We're back to the laws of physics again. Magni went on to explain to me how in his work with Catherine Hunter on King Lear, they analysed the dynamic between Lear and the fool as being like a constant elastic. And this was evident in both actors' physical performances. You can see a little still of it there. Similarly, Tunstall gives an account of the pushing and pulling game which Catherine Hunter played in rehearsals for her 2009 production of Othello for the Royal Shakespeare Company. Magni describes this process as one of finding the game inherent in the text. He gave the scene in The Merchant of Venice in which Lancelot Gobbo tricks his blind father as an example, suggesting that when he played the role at Shakespeare's Globe in 1998, his character's objective was, quote, to make my father totally mad in trying to find where I was. How can I make it difficult for him to find me, he said. How can I make my voice come from all different directions? How can I confuse him? How can I make the development of my play become bigger and bigger, wilder and wilder, nastier and nastier? In our own field, Tom Bishop has done some brilliant work in analysing Shakespearean scenes for their own inherent game-like structures. Magni's fellow Lecoq graduate John Wright, meanwhile, uses similar terminology in his book Why Is That So Funny?, arguing that games have the same function as an objective. The plot gives you the dramatic context, says Wright, but the game gives us the life of the interaction. Games give you a simple structure in which to play an objective, and you must, he says, addressing the actor, you must play to win. If he were directing a production of Hamlet, he goes on, he would encourage you to play every interaction, to find games between you, and to find games within games. Interestingly, though, he does not appear to see such games as just inherent in the text in the way that Magni and perhaps Bishop do. The text will sit on top of all this, he argues, create resonance and generate meaning. Game, for Wright, seems to be superfluous, adding a textual layer all of its own. Perhaps then, clowning might be described not so much as a language, but as a particular communicative strategy. There are certainly comic physical theatre traditions with specific codified gestural languages. Commedia dell'arte could be considered a prime example. But Magni, who's trained in commedia, bristles at the suggestion that its language is fixed. I would say that commedia dell'arte is also a spirit of how to play, he told me. Therefore, it's not necessarily only a style. This spirit may be defined as a propensity towards play, an attitude which the Lecoq-trained director Ariane Mnouchkine describes as jouer frontal, which addresses, plays to, plays with the audience. W.B. Wortham, writing about Grupo Galpeo's first performances of Romeo and Juliet at the Globe in 2000, noted that the company's entire performance is conceived in this dialogic manner, while Moreira himself describes their street theatre tradition as one which, quote, values direct play between the actors and the audience. In her discussion of the Gujarati production of All's Well That Ends Well at Globe to Globe, Bridget Escombe suggests that the performance style of Mansi Parekh's Heli, or Helena, quote, may recall for European theatregoers the Lecoq or Gaulier-trained physical performer who, in the mode of the clown, shares his or her figure's most delightfully painful emotions with the audience and renders him or herself empathetically vulnerable in their presence. Escombe's careful to acknowledge here that this was not a Lecoq or Gaulier-derived technique. The production style was in fact borrowed from the 19th century Indian popular theatre form of Bangwadi. This was emphatically not a culturally transcendent performance in Escombe's account. She concludes by noting that the production, quote, relies on an audience recognising certain cultural conventions unquestioningly, such as the notion that marriage is always positive for the play's heroine. But the fact that similar strategies can be identified in forms as diverse as Bangwadi, Brazilian street theatre, and Lecoq school physical theatre, suggests that popular clowning, whilst it may not in fact be an international language or even a language in the strictest sense at all, is rather a shared tool for the transposition of verbal language into physiological audience engagement, which then combines with the text to, in Wright's phrase, create resonance and generate meaning in more culturally specific ways. Thank you.